Hello everyone. We are live. Oh, we're live now. It took a second. But welcome everyone. Welcome zetamath.
Hello, thank you.
Welcome everyone in chat. We'll just get straight into it. So, one of the most innovative minds in the Sudoku scene, he has astounded us with novel rule sets from the very beginning. Uh, Sort of a trendsetter in Sudoku variants recently. He has been featured 25 times on CTC and has his own YouTube channel where he's solving puzzles live on stream. He's about to get to almost 100 live streams, which is crazy. You all know him. You all love him. Welcome our guest, zetamath.
Hey, everyone. Zach is here. Fear not. I know many people were worried that Zach would not appear, but he has shown up.
Oh, the
I know
introduction. That was
everyone's
all
really
Zach,
here
of
for
course.
Zach.
Yeah, that was Zach's accomplishments.
Yes,
We
yes.
have a little one for zetamath. We'll do that at the end, maybe. Uh, all right. So, what was the first puzzle that you ever set?
First puzzle I ever set was called Polyominoes 1. You can find it in my spreadsheet. It's not on LMD or anything, but if you go to the zetamath.link/catalog, spelled however it's spelled in your country, then you can click on the first one. So it was deliberately inspired by a puzzle that I really liked, the one that got me to start setting by Sir Woozle. He made a Philomeno-esque killer puzzle or something like that. So this is very literally that. So the
Yeah.
the basic rules are there's like you've got to build your own killer cages, and every killer cage needs to have a circle that tells you how big the cage is. Uh, and so I mean, the rule set was not mine; it was someone else's. So that made it a lot easier to set. I set this puzzle in Excel, which I do not recommend to anyone ever. But I think my first two puzzles were both set in Excel. Uh, and so my first three puzzles actually were just three versions of this sort of idea with slightly different takes each time as I sort of figured out what I liked about the rule set and what I
Hmm.
didn't. And so I think by the third one, I think you're no longer summing anything. Actually, maybe even in the second one, you might not be summing anything, but still building polyominoes in the grid. Uh, the second one was actually the second one is down there right below me. If you look straight down in
Yes, the
the
crafty
thing, you
one,
can see the
right?
second one. That one was featured by Mark, but it was not my first cracking the cryptic feature. Uh,
Hmm.
and that
The
was the
first.
first. It was the earliest of my puzzles to yet be featured on cracking the cryptic, but it was. And who
Right.
knows? They could always go back and decide to do that terrible first puzzle. But I did do that one on stream a while back, and was surprised at how difficult it was. I didn't hate it actually, but it
Hmm.
was was quite challenging. I found like I think it took us like 90 minutes or 2 hours or something when I did it on stream.
Because it's the one that you've forgotten the most about.
Oh yeah, I mean I forget things so fast. I actually just this morning I was thinking to myself about like this new idea for a puzzle, and I was like, oh, I made that puzzle. I was like, what about a fortress puzzle with a negative constraint? And I was like, wait, I did that. uh,
uh, yeah, I think I've done that maybe once or twice. The worst is when you forget something immediately after you thought it. You're like, oh, that would be a good idea for a puzzle. Wait, what idea was that? Wait, no, I've forgotten it already.
yep. I
Usually
know I
happens to
had a
me first thing in the
great
morning.
idea last night. What was it?
Yeah. So speaking of, you mentioned that CTC feature. Uh, the other CTC feature, which was your first one, how long did it take to get the flower featured?
So that's an interesting question. So I think I'd probably been working on setting for 6 weeks or so when I
Hmm.
made flour, and I think it was another. I did actually send in flour. I didn't send in any of the earlier ones, but I sent in flour after flour really got some people excited, and in particular, Sir Woozle, who graciously has tested a lot of my puzzles after inspiring me to start setting in the first
Hmm.
place. It was like, okay, you really need to post this on LMD because this puzzle's great. And so I did that, and it did well there. So then I submitted it to CTC, and so you can go back to the original CTC videos and hear them calling me zetamath. uh, because that is how you say zeta in British.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, but this puzzle was a giant pain to set. Uh, like this is I had this beautiful idea for this grid, but then it has two different global constraints in it that like digits and cages can't be consecutive that are next to each other, and there's this sort of
And
like
the
partial anti-night
yeah.
piece, and so it was just like I'd get to the end of the puzzle and then it would be broken. Like
Hmm.
the very last pair of digits would be forced to be consecutive, and then I do it all over again, and then do it all over again, and this, is that. Uh,
Um, so had you been watching CTC for a while before you started setting, or was it sort of just a natural transition to setting?
it took me a while of watching Cracking the Cryptic. I don't know about time in months, but time and number of videos watched, it was a lot. Because I mean, there's that long period where you discover Cracking the Cryptic, where you've got like years worth of puzzles to go back and watch, and so I at first was watching all of them, and then I got Tristan into it, and then we were watching them together. And so, like, then every day we'd watch the Simon and the Mark from that day, and go back and maybe watch two or three from the old ones. And so, getting to see sort of all of these ideas, and it really was like, I mean, a lot of the puzzles I think actively that you can see, I think actively discourage you from setting. Like, I mean, I think when you see the miracle Sudoku, it basically tells you that you can literally never set anything. It's not going to be
Right.
possible because it is an inhuman construction. Uh, but then it was actually it was that Philomeno puzzle. I was like, I can sort of see how you could make that.
Right.
And then I was like, I wonder if I could make that. And then I sort of sat down to do it and somehow did, although I would not want to speak to exactly what the process was. I was trying to remember that the other day because like I said, I knew it was in Excel. And I mean, I don't think I like started with the grid and worked backwards, but I certainly didn't set it in the way that I would set something today, by
Right.
any means.
So in a few words, how would you describe your setting process today?
For almost all puzzles, my setting process today is start with some interesting deduction. All my puzzles start with some interesting deduction. It doesn't have to be hard, but it has to be something where, like, usually it involves multiple clues sort of interacting together in whatever way.
Hmm.
It involves pencil marking a 4 in target practice, for example, but it's sort of a that sort of thing. So I start with some step that I'm happy to be the first step of the puzzle, and I think that's a bar for me that's really important. Is like I want the first step to be something where I'm like I'm happy with this, and then I just sort of chase what that gives me. And find another deduction I'm happy with, and then another deduction I'm happy with. And so usually the bar for me is that I add a clue to the grid, knowing what it'll do, then it better do something else. And if it doesn't do anything else, if it doesn't surprise me in
Hmm.
any way, then usually I go back and add a different clue and then repeat this process until the puzzle is unique. Often at times having to rewind a bunch back if something sort of like goes down a street that I don't end up liking or whatever. Uh, like, I mean, a lot of the times when I give up on a puzzle, it's when I sort of reach a point where like I feel like every step I can add is boring,
Interesting.
or doesn't really do anything other than like exactly what I intended to. I actually had a really interesting conversation with Naverio the other day that this is a lot of my problem with setting pencil puzzles, actually. Like, I've tried to set a lot of pencil puzzles. I think I've only set one, actually. But in pencil puzzles, it really tends to be the case that every clue you add does exactly what you intend it to do and nothing else. And then that doesn't leave me to feel excited. And then sort of like I was trying very hard to set a nice like arrow Philomeno the other day, and I had some steps I liked, but then I was just like, okay, but now this is just sort of like I just have to like if I want to add a border here, I just basically have to add a border here. Who wants to do that?
Right.
Uh,
I think I get that feeling a little bit. It also kind of makes me think, going a little bit off topic, but it makes me think that maybe that's the reason why some puzzles that you set tend to be a little bit harder, because sometimes in an easy puzzle it's really good if you want to gauge the difficulty of the step to say, well, if I can see what this step is going to do before I even like add the clue for it, then the solver will intrinsically know, oh, I can see what this is going to do before I even do anything, right? So that sort of leads to an easier puzzle. But you're saying I really hate when that happens. So that
So
is
I
that
would say I want to see what it's going to do, but then
mhm.
I want it to do something else too.
Surprising, yeah.
So, yeah. So I wanted to do one more thing. Like if a clue
Right.
in a grid only does one thing, I feel like it's not really a puzzle. It's just sort of a string of steps.
Okay.
It's the interaction between the things that I feel like makes it this sort of like complicated machine that I like to see in puzzles. Uh, so that's sort of like what I'm looking for. I always, barring when I'm really desperate or when it's like
Yeah.
almost unique, I'm always adding a clue knowing it will do something, like it will place a one somewhere
Right.
or will change the shape of this cage or whatever. But I then want to see like, oh, but also it does this other thing and this
Hmm.
other thing that I didn't anticipate. But if I look at it closely, I can see that.
Right. Okay.
I do think the weakness in this is that if a puzzle takes me a long time to set,
Hmm.
then my bar for interesting for the first move can go up too high. Because what might have been interesting to me when I started setting the puzzle might now not feel interesting to me, having now done these deductions for a lot of time. So I think that's something I try to be cognizant of, but I'm not always great at maintaining the like, okay, I want this to be interesting for someone who's looking at it for the first time,
Hmm.
not someone who's been throwing themselves at this wall for 2 weeks at this point.
Right. It's hard to get out of your own echo chamber, I guess, when you're setting something for a really long time. It's interesting that you say that you when you're setting something for a really long time, the bar for the first step becomes higher. Would you say that you restart your puzzles very often? Because obviously, if you're setting something for a very long time, I'm assuming you have a first step already. So did you restart your puzzle and then try to find a different first step?
I will say usually if a puzzle takes me a long time, it
Hmm.
usually means that I've had to change the first step. Uh, Not universally so, but for example, double dip, I had a completely different break in. Like completely, and it just I could not get it to sort of like evolve into anything. Like it amounted to like all the deductions. What they were doing was they were all telling me where things were, and it was going to turn into one of those puzzles where I was going to place all the 3x3s. This is one of these deconstruction puzzles. I don't think it's super relevant to the story, but you were going to place all the 3x3s before you actually did any Sudoku, and then do Sudoku, and that was going to be boring. And I realized that sort of intrinsic to the way I had set up that break in was the fact that I was going to force all the geometry first. And
Right.
I do have some puzzles that are really genuinely two-phase puzzles, like Modern Romance. But I generally try that if I'm going to do a puzzle that's about the interaction between Sudoku and geometry, to have them sort of bounce back and forth. And so eventually, the way I did double dip, that happened a lot, but I had to abandon everything and start over and understand why it was that the break in I had was going to force that and how I could possibly do a break in that doesn't.
Right. Okay. I think you said in your setting video that the main chunk of your time is actually finding the break-in that you like, or at least for some puzzles. Specifically, I think you mentioned ambiguity. It was basically all just the break-in, and then everything else was just, oh, it just said itself.
That does very often happen. Like, I mean, when setting is at its, we'll say, happiest, is when I find something and then I just sort of am able to like say, okay, well, this gives me that, and then I can use that to do this, which then gives me that, which then gives me this, and so on and so forth. And so, like, there are many puzzles of mine where that sort of is what happened. I figured out, okay, how do I want to set this up? And then once I figured out, okay, what do I want the first step to be? Then it was pretty easy to follow the deduction from that and that and that. The problem is when you get a first deduction that doesn't actually tell you enough to then really let you naturally do something else, and then it's a little bit tricky. Uh, but you'll see I've reused a lot of first deductions because then it's cheap. So the opening from ambiguity one has appeared in probably 5 of my puzzles in some slight variation.
Hmm.
Uh, So if you were to look at like the signature Zeta setup, it is those thermos poking into box 5, where you have sort of two
Oh,
circles
yes. Okay.
looking at these things sort of poking in. That is the canonical like what Zeta does if Zeta doesn't know what to do with something. So if you
The
like
like,
look at Medusa, Medusa is set up exactly like this. And if you look closely at Zeta's Nightmare, it's set up exactly like this. And so there's just a lot of puzzles where you can sort of use that sort of setup.
the favorite geometry step, essentially.
Right, right. Is the sort of like it would be impossible except, and then whatever the thing
Right.
is
Except for
the
this
sort of
one
thing.
scenario.
Yes, except for the fact that we have doublers, or except for the
Right.
fact that we have whatever the thing is.
Box 5 again in Medusa.
Yes, yes. Oh, it is. It is. In Zeta's Nightmare, it's really subtle because it's in box 8 instead. Because I needed to fit a long line in column 5, and so I didn't have room to put it in box 5. But if you go back and look, like the eye has that set up to
Yes, yes.
ambiguity 2 has that set. It's everywhere
Right.
in my puzzles. Uh,
So we're talking a lot about break-ins, but well, actually, I did want to ask. So you tend to say the first step, right? But a lot of
mhm.
people say for this sort of thing, the break-in. So is that a different thing for you, or are you talking about the same thing that other people are talking about?
So when people say the break-in, I think
Hmm.
usually what they're thinking of is they're thinking of some really hard combination of almost everything in the grid that gives you to what often ends up turning into a one-step puzzle effectively, where they're thinking of like there's going to be this one difficult step, and then I'm just going to add clues until it's unique. Uh,
Interesting.
and I don't set puzzles like that broadly. I think you could argue that you could certainly argue, and I would be convinced that 2D wave particles is that.
Hmm.
Uh, but most puzzles I don't. And so I think actually a lot of people, when they're solving my puzzles, I see a lot of people comment like, "Oh wow, I got a digit so fast." Uh, and usually I'm not. I don't necessarily, when I say I want there to be an interesting first step, it's not that I want the first step to take forever.
Hmm.
Very often there's digits pretty fast. And so I tend to think a lot of times when people think around break ins, they're thinking a little bit too much warped from watching too many Simon videos of like puzzle you have to stare at for a while before it gives you anything.
Right.
Uh, and at least for me as a solver, that's not really what I like, and it's really not my style as a setter either. If something really lends itself to like, okay, I've actually thought of a way to sort of combine these ideas that's really neat, and I think it is interesting, then maybe I'll do it. But most of
Hmm.
the time, I'm not looking for like I would say generally, I think it's better to not aim to have your puzzles have something called a break-in. Uh, and sort of at least not with a capital B. Plenty of people will use break-in to just say, "Oh, the first
Yeah.
step is this," in which case, yeah, then I'm using it the same way. But usually, when people say break-in, I think they're picturing something more grandiose than what I'm picturing.
Interesting. I value that distinction that you're making. Um, I think what you're saying is that it boils down to that people like doing things in puzzles, and just not doing anything for a long time at the beginning is kind of boring as a solver. So it's nice to be able to actually like color something or put a digit in or put some pencil marks in or actually do something. Like it just feels
I,
good.
I, Yes, absolutely. I agree. I think there are a handful of setters where I've used the phrase productive staring before,
Yeah.
where I'm staring at something, but I feel like I'm learning as I stare at it, and I'm like looking at this, and I'm like, okay, so this is really important, and it's like this or that, or like I feel like I'm sort of leveling up in my understanding, even if there isn't anything I can meaningfully
Right.
pencil mark. Uh, of course, now that we have so many different things we can pencil mark with color, often, and since when I'm streaming, I try and visually communicate anything I'm
Hmm.
learning. It might be the case that I'm not literally putting nothing in the grid. But I agree broadly, and I think especially if someone is setting and they're asking for advice, I think let people do stuff is a simple but useful piece of advice to have.
Now, another thing that I sort of took out from your setting video that I found interesting was that you said that you wouldn't recommend using the same type of deduction repeatedly throughout the puzzle to keep the puzzle from being repetitive or boring. That's sort of, I know Bramster brought this up, using an idea repeatedly to sort of teach someone that idea. And I like that idea as well, to repeat things in puzzles. So I think that's sort of the thing that we slightly differ on. Is that correct, or is it something different that you're talking about?
So I think there's really sort of two flavors of
Hmm.
enjoyment in puzzles, and I think I would not have understood this now. So I would frame this differently now.
Okay.
But I would say that there's flow puzzles where the enjoyment is that sort of state of, and then I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this.
Hmm.
The kind of thing where I realize 10 minutes have passed since I've looked at chat because just stuff has been
Right.
happening and I've been doing it and doing it and doing it. And I'm just sort of like, I'm so sucked into the zone of doing stuff.
There's always something to
Uh,
look at.
and then there's the CTC style of puzzle, which is the like, okay, what I'm looking for is I'm looking to feel clever and I'm looking to understand the complicated interactions between these things. And I'm looking for that moment of clear communication that
Hmm.
Clover talks about, where I'm looking to have this thought that's so specific, but that I'm certain was exactly the thought I was supposed to have at this moment.
Interesting.
And that just sort of like the joy of that moment of like, oh, uh, and I'd say in the puzzle where you're trying to have that second kind of experience, yeah, you don't want it to be repetitive.
Right.
Uh, but I think for a lot of the best puzzles that are trying to get to the flow thing, like here I'm picturing Clover puzzles. Like I think I basically, when I said you shouldn't do this, I think I basically described Clover puzzles.
Oh
And
no.
I love Clover puzzles. So I am uh, I definitely would say now that like having solved a lot more, I think you can do that. Now, what Clover somehow is able to do time and time again is to repeat the same idea, but a little harder each time.
Hmm.
Which I don't understand how you can have that much grid control. Like I really honestly don't. But I think when you can do that, then you're including variety in the thing. But yeah, I do very often like catch myself like, well, I already like did this thing, so I don't really want to do it again unless there's some like really good reason to do it.
I think at the
So
same point you had mentioned that you you said something like you're drawn to aesthetics when setting, and I'm not sure if you expanded on that. What exactly does that mean to you?
I really want the grid at the end of the day to look good.
Okay.
And a lot of times where I end up sort of like trashing something is like, I'm going to have to add a clue to this constellation of stuff. And anywhere I add a clue to this, it's just going to look heinous.
Hmm.
Uh, and I understand that's a little vague. Like, I don't necessarily know exactly why I would say that most of these grids hopefully look good. But I'd say one thing that people talk about a lot is symmetry. And I
Hmm.
think I wouldn't use the word symmetry. I think symmetry can be a trap as a setter, but repeated visual themes, I think,
Okay.
are a good way to use it. And so it's almost the same, but it's slightly offset or whatever, just because you can really box yourself in if you're trying to make a pretty grid and you start out symmetric, symmetric, symmetric. At some point, you have to break the symmetry, and it gets harder and harder and harder the more clues you add to the grid to then say, okay, well, I'm going to find a way that looks good to do this. And so that sort of like part of it is I want this to sort of like have a repeated sort of motif, but maybe it's
Right.
not quote unquote symmetrical.
Or with Clover puzzles you mentioned, it's almost a logical motif rather than a visual motif. So there's, I guess, a difference in terms of setting there.
Although I would say Clover grids still look like
Yeah,
if you look
they
at
do.
them, they're all top grids in terms of aesthetics, even if it
Yeah.
might be difficult to articulate like why does this
Why?
arrangement of white and black dots look good. I think it's still often true that you can look at it and go, yeah, they do.
Hmm. So speaking of aesthetics and like how something can sort of stand out and look I don't know what word I was using there, but I know there is
Thought
a
you were going
word
to say
there.
gaudy.
No, not gaudy. Ga something. Ga. When things look ga. Um, what are your thoughts on using sort of as I would call them like small clues to disambiguate like like a black crop dot is the favorite example for your kind
Uh,
of.
so this is something where I think I am in the minority among the setting community, but I think single black dots, at least if they're well placed, very often will look very good in a grid. I think they tend to sort of draw the eye and they tend to not be too obtrusive, but they sort of like add, like they turn it into almost like one of those like abstract art pieces where there's like a bunch of simple things and then a little like black dot or whatever. And a lot of times when people argue against this, their argument is, I don't want to add a whole rule to the puzzle in order to disambiguate it at the end. And so I think that if someone who's solving your puzzle, it views adding a black dot as adding a rule to the puzzle,
Hmm.
you're setting for a very specific audience, which is not the audience that most of the people who have this conversation are setting for.
Hmm.
Uh, so most of the people who are solving most of these puzzles know what a black dot means. You
Right.
definitely need to like make sure if you're setting for an audience where that's not the case that you are using it appropriately. But adding a black dot to a grid for most solvers is not going to shock them. And like even if someone's a new solver, by the time they've solved 20 puzzles or seen 10 Simon videos, they're going to know what a black dot is. And
Hmm.
so I don't think I don't think of it as adding to the logical load to use a black dot or a white dot uh, to uh, to disambiguate a puzzle. Would be my way of thinking about it.
What would you say to some people who would call that sort of a cop-out strategy of disambiguating the puzzle at the end? Like maybe you should rewind and do something different so that you don't have to add the black dot, is a lot of people's argument.
So I would say that I think what you have to decide as the setter is which of these things leads to the best path.
Hmm.
Maybe a given digit leads to the best path, but maybe a black dot leads to the best path, or maybe a white dot, or maybe whatever else. Now, note I'm not saying two cell thermo because I think two cell thermos are intrinsically ugly from a purely aesthetic point of view. Like, I don't think using two cell thermos to disambiguate puzzles is bad because it's using a different rule. I think it's bad because they look horrendous. And so I think that you only make setters make worse puzzles if you say, well, the only of these tools that you're allowed to use is this one because somehow given digit is better than whatever these other things are.
I'm just gonna set a puzzle and add a black dot at the end, and then say in the rules the black dot means that the top digit is less than the bottom digit, just to just for you. It
There you go. Yeah, perfect,
looks
perfect.
great in the puzzle, much better than two cell thermo, uh,
Oh God,
or
Jay
ROG and two
Dyer in
cell
chat
thermo.
mentions the wrong two cell thermo, which just pains me so much. Uh,
Speaking of, we were talking a bit about your setting video, and Woofers FG asked, how do you feel about that video now? What would you do differently in terms of the advice you give to setters if you were hypothetically to make another setting video?
so I think the one thing that I think was really good in my original setting video, like something that I think I said but could have emphasized even more, is the extent to which I find a lot of interesting logic by breaking my puzzle and then rather
Hmm.
than just rewinding, trying to understand why the puzzle was broken. So that, and
Yes.
I think that that is something that I think is super useful. On the other hand, something I think that is lacking or could be better emphasized, and something that I think I've really leveled up as a setter since then, is how to make simpler twists on things. So I think at that point, most of my puzzles were sort of like a really complicated mess of rules, which can be great. And
Hmm.
I think since then I've had a lot of puzzles where it's sort of like the twist on a standard constraint is so small And I think aiming people at that might help a lot of setters who are sort of starting out to sort of figure this out.
Right.
But I think overall, I think my advice was good, but I think my setting is now broader than it was then. And so I think I would probably speak to a slightly broader range. I mean, all my puzzles are still weird, but but the senses in which they could be weird, I think they're less. I mean, some of them are still ridiculous, but I think I'd try and sort of hit a little bit wider.
Okay, so speaking of that, what about novel rule sets do you love so much?
So a lot about what I enjoy when I'm doing a puzzle, I often use the word clever, and clever is sort of like your brain bending in a way that it hasn't bent before. And if you
I
have
would not
a
want my brain to bend. Maybe wrinkle.
and it wrinkle in a way that it doesn't. I mean, and if you have a novel rule set, it's just a lot easier to do that. And the fruit can be very low hanging. If I want to set a pure arrow puzzle that requires playmaker to have a thought that they've never had before, uh,
Impossible.
that is going to be a like 17-star puzzle automatically. Uh, but it's pretty easy if you add a rule that no one's seen before to have pretty low hanging fruit
Right.
that is nevertheless uh, sort of in that space. So I think for me, the real advantage, and I know a lot of people will disagree with me saying this, but I think the real advantage for me in novel rule sets is that it makes easier puzzles.
Kind of ironic because some people would say that you make harder puzzles in general.
I would say that's true that people say that, although I would also say that I think the people who say that are people who've solved lots of puzzles.
Hmm.
And so they're used to seeing all of the standard arrow tricks. And so something that someone who was doing their fifth arrow puzzle might just view as impossible to them is just sort of like, oh, this is the add to at least 15 trick. So pencil mark 6, 7, 8, 9, and this length to arrow, go on and go on and go on.
Hmm.
Uh, I think for someone who is in that boat, seeing my puzzles, I think they're often able to do them, whereas it's just impossible for them to do a lot of the puzzles that are in the 3, 4 star range on LMD. And so I think one of the most common comments you see, if you, as I do, obsessively read all of the comments on your CTC features, or all the comments on my CTC features at least, is there's lots of people who are like, this is the first 5 star puzzle I've ever done, or this is the first over an hour Simon video puzzle I've ever been able to actually do myself, or whatever version of that. And I think that's because a lot of the times the hard step is hard because you haven't seen it before, rather than hard
Hmm.
because it's oblique or something that you're supposed to have. Like we've talked a lot in the past in various of your previous things about how I'm not really a big fan of set because it's sort of this like black magic principle that if you
Yes,
know then makes you able to solve these things, but unless someone has told you, uh, it's just not going to be on your radar. And that's the kind
exactly.
of thing I try to avoid in puzzles where possible.
I think that's a really interesting idea that people find the puzzles harder because they're not used to as many things within the puzzles. And I think what's interesting there is that a lot of novel rule sets tend to actually lend themselves to familiar logic, at least the ones that I see often. They tend to maybe you can use a similar, like as you said, 6, 7, 8, 9, add to 15 in the row or column. They align. These things are sort of like summing these things, so you can do that same trick, even though it's a different novel rule set. Would you say you tend to avoid stuff that allows you to do similar deductions like that?
So I think one of the cheapest ways to get sort of fun deductions is to take a slight twist on a rule that people already know and let them ask
Right.
themselves, does this thing I think I know still work? So, like
Hmm.
an example from one of my puzzles is Kodama, which is a pure German or almost pure German. I guess it's a German Whispers X puzzle, but it's also an S cell puzzle. And so you now have the digits 0 through 9 instead of the digits
Hmm.
1 through 9. And so you think, okay, well, when I see a German whispers, the thing I want to do is color highs and lows. Does that still work? Uh, is that true or does it not work? And you think to yourself, oh, I can't put a 5 1 in X. That's one of the things I know about X's, but can I put a 5 1 in X in this puzzle? And so you get to ask yourself, like, piece by piece about these standard deductions. Does this still work? And I think that's really fun to sort of think through these things that maybe you've just sort of internalized to the point where it's almost dogmatic. I think it's fun to then ask yourself, okay, does this imply a no checkerboard rule? Or whatever. And so I think that's actually great if
Hmm.
things that are sort of very close to your standard logic end up working. But I think it's fun if someone has to pause and figure out, okay, what things that I think I know do I still know?
Yeah, that is fun. When I looked at this Kodama puzzle, I started it for a while and sort of decided I didn't know anything and everything was false now, even though that's not true. And then I was like, oh, I can't do this puzzle because nothing works anymore. Uh, but I did Paradox by Zeno, so I think I could do this one because everything does actually apply. I just didn't think about it enough. Um, it's funny. Sometimes you get an idea into your head and you can't get out of it when you're solving. Like, oh, it doesn't work, and then you just never think about it again. I
Oh,
guess that
absolutely.
happens
I
when
mean,
you're
that
studying too.
happens to me all the yeah, that
Yeah.
happens to me all the time when I'm streaming, is that I'll be like, oh, but I can't make this deduction because whatever. And I'm just like, okay, well, I'm just immediately tossing that out. And only because Chad is there to be like, no, 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 look back, look at that again. And then I'm like, oh, the thing I was thinking would put two fives in the box or whatever thing that I've
Hmm.
sort of convinced myself is okay is not
Yeah.
actually okay.
Whenever I'm watching one of my puzzles get solved by you and you say something like that, I'm like, no, no, Chad, please help him. No. This will be so long if he doesn't realize.
Like, oh no.
Yeah, but it doesn't happen that often. Just like once or twice. Usually it's pretty smooth. So speaking of streaming, solving, I think I have one question by Hippo, which it's by Gum Hippo, which is very apt for talking about streaming. How do you concentrate on streams for 4 to 8 hours? What do you do during breaks for mental replenish?
So I amazingly when I started, 8 hours is pretty easy. Like there's a lot of adrenaline when you start streaming. I don't know if you found this, but it's sort of like it just sort of carries you through. And so like I know Tallcat actually said the same thing when he guested on my stream, was like, oh, I was hesitant to be on an 8 hour stream, but then it just snapped by.
Did
Uh
you feel that adrenaline sort of leave your body as soon as the camera turned off? Because that happened to me.
yes, that
Okay.
certainly is the case.
You just
Uh
collapse in your chair.
Now, I'd say over time I've gotten more used to streaming, which is, I think, a good thing overall. But it does mean that now, if I do an 8 hour stream, now it feels like I'm streaming for 8 hours.
Right.
It feels like I imagine streaming for 8 hours would feel, rather than feeling like, oh, I just stopped. As far as like what I actually do during breaks, usually I scroll through a list of puzzles to decide which one I feel like doing next, or run and talk to Tristan or whatever. Just to sort of like I often try and move a little bit just so
Hmm.
I'm not sitting
Just
for all of these hours, although
move a little bit.
yeah, exactly. But anyway, you'll notice there aren't any 8 hour streams in my schedule anymore, and that's not an
Hmm.
accident. uh
Yeah. That's why I don't
um
well, except for these interview streams, I don't usually set like a time amount because if I feel like I need to stop, then I'm gonna stop. It doesn't matter if I said it's gonna be 4 hours or 8 hours, I'm gonna stop when I need to stop.
and originally that's how it started. It just sort of turned out that there was
Right.
sort of an established sort of like, oh, it's usually about this long, so then I sort of ended up codifying it a bit.
Hmm.
uh Now that I have some people who will like support me on Patreon or whatever, I figure it's reasonable to have a like established commitment to like how much they're supporting me for or whatever.
Yeah, that's fair. Um, Ambrose had asked, has experience streaming solves affected how you set puzzles?
So I think in a small way, in that now I've solved a lot more puzzles. So I spend like a designated 12 hours a week at least solving puzzles. And so I get to be like, oh, I liked this, or oh, I didn't like this. And now I definitely cannot put that one annoying step that I would complain about in one of my in a puzzle that I then post, because then everyone will rightfully complain about it because they know I'd complain about it if I put it in one of my puzzles. Uh, except when I accidentally did that in vignettes. Sorry to everyone who accidentally missed that in vignettes or experienced that in vignettes. But I'd say that for me, it's really hard for my solving brain to affect my setting brain.
Hmm.
I don't usually sort of like, people often ask, like, do you get ideas from the puzzles you solve? And occasionally, like, I certainly got the idea for Archa. I basically had already decided what it was going to be by the time I was done streaming the first SL puzzle I ever did.
Hmm.
Uh, but most of the time, my brain, when it's focused on solving, is focused on solving. The thing that often actually does give me lots of ideas is anytime I'm watching anyone else solve something,
Right.
then somehow my brain will go, oh, okay, or I could do that or that. I don't know why exactly. I don't have a good explanation for why, but I'd say usually not at the time I'm doing it am I thinking about setting. It's more often perhaps reflection later. But I think the thing that it's helped the most with is making me articulate what I like in solving and what I don't like in solving, both for myself and for my viewers when I'm explaining it, and thinking about how that contrasts with what other people are looking for in puzzles they solve and set and that kind of thing.
Would you say that the chat helps you to determine what other people see when they solve in the same way that watching someone solve helps you with that? Or is it less
It's
helpful?
it's really interesting to me, but it's hard to know what to do with the data sometimes. So I
Hmm.
certainly have a great sense of what some of my active viewers see when they look at a grid and how completely different it is than what I see when I look at a grid. Because I mean, some of them are just amazing and will just
Yeah.
constantly see this, and then they'll say a thing, and I'll stare at it, and I'll stare at it, and I'll stare at it, and then I'll go, "Oh wow, they're right." But how on earth, what combination of things went on in their brain that made them realize that, like, if I put a 7 there, then I couldn't put a 4 in this row that's 3 rows away
Yeah.
through this, whatever it is. So I do think there's some element of that. I mean, I think one thing that chat really helps with is the fact that it smooths over the ugly parts of puzzles. So
Hmm.
if there's a hidden 3, someone's going to find it. And I just be like, oh, it's a hidden 3. Just move on. And then I don't have to worry about it. Whereas, if I was looking for a hidden 3, it might take a while if that was the thing I was really supposed to find. Uh, so I think that the sort of like the many sets of eyes makes the solving process more fun, would be one
Definitely.
note.
I noticed in your streams you often will sort of refuse to move on from a step until you feel like you've rigorously proved it, even if maybe you or other people can intuitively see why it's true. Why such rigor in the puzzles?
I mean, I think there's two reasons for that.
Okay,
I mean, answer one is because I'm a mathematician, so this is just who I am.
fair enough.
Uh, but I mean, I think answer two is I'm very well aware of the fact that sort of like actually a very intuitive mathematician. And so I will very often believe something, like I'll be like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is true. But then it will turn out to be completely false, like time and time and time again. Uh, and so, I mean, if you want to see demonstrations of this or see this in yourself, just try a compass puzzle. Any
Yes.
compass puzzle, where it will be intuitively obvious to you that something is true, and then you'll break the puzzle, and then you'll go, "Wait, actually, I missed the possibility that this region that was labeled with a single clue that was a 1 is actually 43 cells in size, and gets that 1 after wrapping around all of these things or whatever. So I'd say often it's sort of a fear of, what if I say something that's wrong? I mean, and it's fine if I say something that's wrong. It's not like it's a big deal. Just rewind or whatever. But I want to
Mhm.
like make sure I really understand what's going on. And so if there's something where it's like, I'm not 100% sure I actually believe this, then we get that. And so actually the frac is actually specifically designed so that someone who really rigorously tries to prove that that the intuitive break-in is correct can do it without too much
Right.
pain. Although I think Simon exercised more pain than was strictly necessary in his version of the break-in, because
Yes.
he started looking at it. I think in his mind, unlike everyone else I saw, his intuitive guess as to what the answer was wrong. Uh,
Interesting.
he was like, it's one of these things, and these are obviously wrong, so it's got to be this one. How can I prove it? And so there's some extra circles there that are really just there to help people who are going to be rigorous see that, like, well, there aren't 4 regions on the border, uh,
Mhm.
or whatever appropriate version of this there is. So it's something I think about a lot when I'm setting. I mean, and heaven forbid when you're setting, you make one of these errors and it turns out that actually your puzzle has more than one solution or whatever. Uh, so I think there's some of that as well. Um,
Yeah, I tend to be almost the opposite of you in terms of like how much rigor I want for a deduction. I'm like, oh, this seems true. Yeah, I'm good with this. This is good. This seems true. And then I move on. And it tends to break puzzles more often, but I tend to learn things from the broken puzzle. Uh, and then I completely understand what I've done wrong and what I need to do now, which makes for enjoyable solve paths for me, but maybe not such enjoyable experiences to watch because I'm just like, oh, now I get it. It has to do this instead. Okay, we're good. Moving on.
and I have toned that down a bit over time.
Mhm.
I think as I've sort of like learned sort of like from watching other people and sort of thought about it and sort of how to approach this. And I think in particular, one thing I've noticed, and this goes back to the like, what if I learned about how people think about these things, is that when people think particularly about pencil puzzles, often they're thinking much more intuitively rather than
Mhm.
rigorously. And so a lot of the arguments, particularly connectedness arguments, are making something that you could phrase and to say some topological thing that's a little bit messy and precise, but that if you
Yeah.
develop the intuition for it, then it's sort of like it's the same argument over and over and over again. And so I've sort of tried to develop a better intuitive sense, particularly for connectedness arguments, so that I
Mhm.
can sort of believe when people tell me these things. Although then I feel weird trying to articulate to chat why this thing that I just am like, well, in my heart of hearts, I believe it has to go this way. Is I
You
feel
just
slightly dirty when I say something like that. That is sort of like I realize I'm not being rigorous, but I'm sure that if I was rigorous, I could prove the thing. Uh, but I think the reality is the majority of viewers are not really not as bothered by it as I would be as a viewer seeing these sorts of things.
you just don't want to mention the word manifold in the stream. That's probably not a good idea.
I have done my very best to avoid doing that.
So one
Yeah,
thing we
this
mentioned.
did come
So,
up. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, no, go ahead before
I
we
was
move
gonna
on.
say this did come up a lot in the discussion around double dip, because double dip is one
Hmm.
of these like deconstructions where you need to put nine
Yeah.
3x3s into a grid, and the first deduction you get about this is this really difficult combinatorial deduction. I think that you always cover these 9 cells, and so I just included that statement in the rules. Like, you don't have to think about this. I'm just going to tell you. And I even in the rules I say it's deducible. I don't say, so if someone wants to think about why it's true, they're welcome to think about why it's true. Uh, but they aren't obligated to, because I wanted to again sort of protect the poor minds of people who did not know this, who might then try and figure out what the right way to color the grid in 9 colors to prove this is. Uh,
It's pretty funny actually because I wasn't gonna bring this particular point up because I do feel like it is not that hard of a combinatorics problem to solve, uh, because I don't personally want to do it rigorously. It seems very intuitive to me, um, but in in my puzzle, which was friendly ropes, I, I shouldn't argue with you about this because I actually did the same thing and put these cells as these are in the grid. But for a couple reasons. One reason was that I wanted to say um, that these are the boxes 1 to 9 labeled as such because there's friendly in the thing. So you have to do friendly with the
Ah,
boxes. And I
got it.
really didn't want to be like, there is a box 1. You will have to find the box 1 and then label it. Like, that does not, no, nope, that does not
Yes,
work.
yes, that is that makes a lot of sense.
So I feel slightly hypocritical doing the same thing as you when I critiqued your doing it. So
My thought was I don't think I cost anyone any value
no,
because I do say you can prove it. And so if they say, okay, well, I don't believe it or I don't know why it's true, they can prove it. It's right there. So I figured it wouldn't actually hurt anyone that badly.
I mean if you have to use that fact to begin the puzzle, then yeah, maybe it's a good idea to give it. There are a lot of puzzles like using deconstruction where you don't actually need to use that at all, and you can solve it just fine without that. But if you
I
do have,
seem to
yeah,
recall Jay Dyer telling me at one point that, and I apologize if this is wrong, but I seem to recall her telling me that when she set this puzzle, she did not even notice this.
no, she
So,
didn't.
like, if the puzzle is not in any way benefited by by this fact, then I would probably not call it out. But in the case of double dip,
Usually,
it's part of the break-in.
yeah,
Uh,
usually it's easier to think about the deductions when you have that understanding, but just like saying this is a region, can this be the same region? No, it's too far away. Is reasonable as well. Um, but it does help with finding deductions like that.
But I definitely remember the first time I was doing one of these puzzles on stream, and chat was trying to tell me this. I was like, "There's just no way that's true. I don't believe you." And then it took a lot of looking through it, and then eventually realizing uh, what was going on, or eventually sort of coming to a proof that I was happy with, and going, "Oh wow, okay, that makes sense to me." Uh, I certainly, it wasn't something where when I first saw the claim, I didn't think, oh, that's intuitively true, but I need to rigorously prove it. My original reaction was, that can't possibly be true. Why on earth would that be true? And so that inspired, that wasn't me attempting to be rigorous. That was me just like not buying it when someone said this.
Interesting. Okay. A while ago, I'm not sure when, but we had mentioned sort of chat saying this thing would affect a row very far away. And I think you did mention maybe in your setting video or maybe in our discussion on a different video about the distance between deductions and how you really like when it's surprising how far away something affects something else. Uh, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't talk about very much, but I think some people hate that. So why do you like that so much?
So when I say that, I mean something like so, like pull up the grid for MIA. Uh, so in MIA, for instance, there's this 1 in row 1. And the 1 in row 1 is rather far. There's not a 1 in row 1. Oh, sorry, there's a 3. It's a 3. Sorry,
Okay,
there's
I
a
was
3
like,
in row
there's
1.
not a row. There's not a one.
Sorry, there's a
Yeah,
3
okay.
in row 1, and so within the rules of this puzzle, like a polyomino has to have size, or the digit that contains it. Sorry, its size has to be a digit inside it. So
Yes,
if you're going to
yes.
have a size 3 polyomino, and it has to have a 3 in it. So the given 3 that is hanging out there eventually tells you, oh, wait, this thing can't be a triomino
Yes.
because every cell in it sees a 3, so it has to grow.
Hmm.
So that 3 is pretty far away, but the deduction isn't, I don't think it's oblique. So I would not be as enthralled with it if you saw this by like needing to pass through multiple rows or whatever. I just think it's exciting when your things interact across. Like, I think it's more exciting than if the 3 was right next to the place where you need to make this deduction. If
Interesting.
the
Okay.
3 is sort of on the other side. I
Yeah.
guess okay. So I guess now that I'm thinking about it, you've made me realize something new. So it was a good question. I think of a puzzle as a giant machine of interconnecting pieces, and whenever you get a deduction that relates to things that are far apart, you're just sort of further thinking about this giant machine and its interconnected pieces.
hmm And what's really surprising is how the 1 in row 1 affects it, but it's not even given. So, um,
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, the invisible given one.
yeah, I wrote it in invisible ink. You should have seen it. um, um, question. Ron Planer had asked if you had to choose between setting your own puzzles and solving puzzles from others, what would you choose and why?
I saw this. That's a hard question.
I know.
Uh, I think at this point it would be harder for me to stop setting than to stop solving. Uh, and I might be able
hmm
to watch other people solve other people's puzzles with the exact wording of the exact wording of the question. Uh, but
Trying to find loopholes in the question.
exactly, exactly. But yeah, but I do quite like solving puzzles at this point. So it would be a shame to lose either of them. But I think at this point I'm more addicted to setting. Like I think setting is my main creative outlet. So at this point, at least, so I think I need that.
Okay, so would you set puzzles even if no one would solve them?
So this is a place where I think Clover and I are in very different places. So Clover, so I think this actually, I could be wrong, but I think this
Yeah,
question sort of originates back to, I think in Clover's setting video, I believe she said that she would set puzzles even if no one saw them. And I mean,
even if
she
she was the
often
only person
does.
on Earth, she said.
Yeah, and she often does like just set a puzzle and then post it in like VC1 in Discord, and then it's gone unless you do. So like, I mean, 100% this is true of Clover, that she would do this. I think verifiably so.
Mhm.
Uh, Definitely for me, setting puzzles is something I do for the reaction that other people are going to have to it, and for the experience that they're going to have to it. So for me, it's really like, I mean, I think it quite literally is designing a single player game for someone to play. It's a short game, uh, but it's a game nonetheless. And so uh, I wouldn't design a board game if I didn't have anyone to play it with. I feel like similarly, I wouldn't design a puzzle without someone to solve it for me. Um,
Do you think that affects how you set a puzzle?
Definitely. So I think a lot about audience in setting puzzles, and I try to, as best as possible, sort of like indicate what I think the audience is in whatever direct or indirect way in the puzzles I set to sort of get people who will enjoy them to do them. But I have some sense now. Uh, so I do think a lot about like what will someone think when they get to this step? Will they have this? Will they like this? Will they hate me and never do one of my puzzles ever again or whatever? So yeah, I think it does make me think more about like ultimately I would be unhappy if I was making puzzles that made people not happy or not as happy as they could be. Like I want people to be doing my puzzles because they get some amount of joy out of them, and that's sort of like I would be unhappy if that wasn't the case. And so I
Interesting.
think that means that I'm really more perfectionist as a setter because of that. But what's really interesting to me as I'm saying all of this is Clover also thinks an enormous amount about audience and is
hmm
also one of the most perfectionist people among setters I know. But clearly that comes from a different place than it does for me in her. So that's very interesting to me.
Indeed. I was thinking about the same thing as well because I'm thinking about the people who have said the same perspective as Clover, and I think Jovial is sort of in the same boat where she thinks about the audience perspective very much when she's setting, but she also would just she literally just sets a puzzle and then closes the tab and never shows it to anyone, which is outrageous. Um, but there's also Terganus, who said that he used to set puzzles to impress, but he no longer sets puzzles to impress. He just sort of sets puzzles just to set them, just for fun. And he likes to do sorts of whatever contest type puzzles just to set them, which I think is cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like people solve for a bunch of different reasons, I think people set for a bunch of different reasons, and I think that that is cool. I am all for that, even if they aren't necessarily the same as me. But that just makes the world cooler because there's more diversity in it.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think I described Tirganus's points very well. So if you want to know Tirganus's points, go watch that video where I drew Tirganus as the last setter spotlight. I'll put a card if I remember. Speaking of the reputations of other constructors, how would you describe your reputation as a constructor? And does that match your own perception of yourself?
So I think people generally ascribe me as setting very difficult puzzles, which I don't always think is exactly true. I mean, you did call me out on the fact that I'd never set a 2-star puzzle, and one of the
I
times I
didn't.
was
No,
on
I
your
didn't.
stream.
Someone else did.
I
Oh,
swear it was you.
in someone's stream. Okay. In another stream. Yeah, I think I did. Yeah, yeah, you're right.
And then
did, totally.
I went and promptly set a 2-star puzzle. So now I've set a 2-star puzzle.
Yeah,
Out
I
of
guilted
the,
you to it.
65 or so puzzles. I mean, I think that's actually one distinction between me and a lot of people is like I have set fewer than 70 puzzles ever in total.
Ever.
Despite having done this, is because like they really tend to be like a long experience for me. And I know like a lot of people, and I really admire this, can like set a puzzle in an hour and it will sort of like be this jaw-dropping experience. And I, for better or worse, cannot do this. Like, I mean, I remember actually, I think it was Tirganus that set a puzzle and it took Simon longer to solve the puzzle than it did for Tirganus to set it. And that just is like
Galaga, I think it was.
So the opposite of my lived experience setting puzzles. So I think that is one distinction. I think people tend to think, at least a lot of people, I think, tend to think of my puzzles as being wackier on average than they are. And I think part of that is because like my most viewed Simon feature, for example, is keep talking and no one explodes. And so I think a lot of people think of that as like peak Zeta. Whereas like if you were to like put my puzzles on a spectrum, that's like way at one end of the spectrum of the like this puzzle is just absolute insanity and the rules make absolutely no attempt to hide from you that this puzzle is absolute insanity. But I mean
that's the point.
But I think I set lots of puzzles that are more in the vein of 10 lines or distinction or whatever, where they're like 3-star puzzles that are like almost a vanilla puzzle, but with like a little twist that works out. And so I think that for people who don't do all of my puzzles, but just sort of like know me as a presence, I think they tend to picture Frack or keep talking and no one explodes more than like where my average is, I would say.
More than something like distinction or whatever.
Right, exactly.
So you said that's not the most Zetamathy puzzle. So what is the most Zetamathy puzzle that you've made? What sort of puzzle encapsulates your essence?
I think if you were to say like what, so I think Nabner is probably one of the most Zetamathy puzzles, in that it is a very minor twist on a known rule set, but also the puzzle requires incredibly weird ways of thinking about things, and it requires a lot of coloring. and all these sorts of moments. It's also probably my favorite Simon video out of all of the solves I've seen of various puzzles of mine. So I think this is sort of like medium. This is like the midpoint on the zeta spectrum. Whereas like I think something like MIA, I think is more like I think MIA is my best like puzzle that is really wacky, for example. Although it's funny to me, Kodak in chat mentions two truths and a lie as being a puzzle that demonstrates weirdness, whereas I would be like, two truths and a lie is just a bunch of vanilla constraints with one minor twist. I wouldn't actually even like think of two truths and a lie as being particularly wacky, but maybe that just shows that everyone's right about where I actually am on the spectrum. But
Okay, so Toganus had asked, what's your favorite puzzle versus your best puzzle, and why is that such a distinct concept?
So let's see. So I think MIA is my best puzzle. If I were to pick one, which is conveniently already on the screen.
Conveniently, yes.
Yeah, so I think this, I really got it polished and nailed down. And part of that is that I was filming the whole thing. So self-plug, you can watch the entire process of me setting this puzzle from start to finish in a way that is edited. So you don't have to watch all 20 hours of it or whatever. But I think this is my favorite, or sorry, this is, I think, the best puzzle I've made.
You almost mixed it up.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think my favorite puzzle that I've set is a little bit harder to identify. I have a lot of positive feelings about a lot of them. Let's see. I feel like when I read this question, I knew immediately what the answer was to what my favorite one was that I was going to say here, and now I cannot remember which one I was going to say. I think it actually was the one we were just talking about that I cannot. What is Nabner? There we go. What was the one I was going to say? What was the one with the Nabner lines? I think Nabner might be my favorite puzzle out of the ones I've set. I mean, I think that when you ask it, just to talk about the distinction between the two of them, I think the distinction between what's your favorite and what's the best is that favorite involves a lot of emotional sort of things with it. So like it was like one of those puzzles that I just felt enormously proud of at the time, and I remember everyone solving it and talking to me about it. I really liked Simon's feature of it and all of these sorts of things. So like it means a lot to me, sort of personally, and the same is true of many of my other puzzles, because like a lot of puzzles are real sort of like labors of love. I might also pick Double Dip. Actually, Double Dip might also be in that realm for favorite, just because I think Double Dip is at no point difficult, but it's just fun all the way throughout, and sort of like it is the popcorn of Zeta puzzles. I feel like others might disagree with this assessment, but that I was really just like, I just had so much fun with this puzzle, and I really enjoyed that. So that's also on my list of like potentials for favorites.
Okay, so in the realm of similar types of questions, Andrew Sockets had asked, you often describe certain deductions as being very tall cat-like. What are some of the most zetamathy deductions, and what are some zetamath setting tricks that solvers should look for when solving your puzzles?
So I think trick-wise, I think I start almost all of my puzzles in one of two places, either in the top left corner, or in the bottom middle of row 9. Okay. So I'll let you look at Two Truths and a Lie, or Archa, or MIA, and guess which one it is. I don't have very many puzzles, or box 5. Yeah, I guess occasionally box 5. Though I think in the puzzles that I started in box 5, I think it's very obvious from the grid that I started in box 5. Like ambiguity, I don't think it's a surprise that I started in box 5 if you look at the grid. Yeah, so although I'd say that's probably a distant third. Well, I'm realizing I for favorite puzzles, sorry to go back for a second. 625 is also one of my favorite puzzles. That's the puzzle I made for my anniversary with Tristan. It's in the lower right of this grid. It is in the spreadsheet, but it's not on LMD or anything. But that puzzle, I worked on in secret for a long time to get just right so that it would come out. And like it was supposed to make a shape. Like Panthera was part of it, which I appreciated. Like there's all this sort of stuff, and like I set a fake puzzle in the meantime, which amusingly turned out to be Hydra, so that Tristan could see me working on a puzzle and not realize that I was working on this other puzzle. So that was a very fulfilling sort of process. And then when Simon actually did it and solved it, I was very, very happy. I think that puzzle is genuinely very difficult and has a hidden four that I deeply regret. But going back to, sorry to jump tracks, but I was looking at the things just like that one.
You should have
So I think
mentioned
that
that before you said the emotional part about favorite, and then it would have like gotten the maximum number of brownie points, you know.
that's true. That's true. Yeah.
Anyways, continuing.
So I think those are places where I tend to start. Although I think it's usually not too difficult to spot where I intend people or where I started a puzzle, and almost always because of the way I set. The place that I started is also the place you should start in a puzzle. I know that's not true of all setters. Like a lot of setters are trying to do something else, where it's like I'm going to try and sort of put these pieces together. But that at least is sort of a general piece of advice for me. I mean, the zetamath setup we sort of talked about earlier, showing up in ambiguity and a jajillion other puzzles of mine, is any two, where, as Tristan points out, where is cell X and house Y, particularly with a setup where there's actually two cells that you're looking at. So that one in Medusa is there. It shows up in Double Double. It shows up, I mean, it just shows up all over the place in various forms, but it often looks like those sort of like two lines swirling into a box where you end up having that. It's funny because the Tallcat signature is basically that. It's the between line that sort of scoots across boxes.
So you're projecting.
That started in Cacophony. Which has that, and then Tallcat liked Cacophony, and then Tallcat set a puzzle that in the attributions he said like, oh, I liked Cacophony, so I set this puzzle, and that puzzle was Betwixt, which is a far better puzzle than Cacophony, to be clear. But then sort of Tallcat sort of kept going with this, and so now I sort of stay away from that between line, because now that's the Tallcat between line. But that kind of deduction I like a lot. It's sort of figuring out like, okay, if I can know, I mean, and not so secretly because it lets you color stuff, that I enjoy that game.
So sticking with the theme of favorites and bests and zetamath things, 2 to 10th had asked, out of all the many, many, many unique rule sets that you've created, what is your favorite and why?
So are we saying like favorite is in like I would most want people to like hand me one and then I'd solve it? In that case, I think I would probably say double arrows. Although double arrows, I am wholly aware that for double arrows that like lots of people had sort of used this kind of idea before. So like, I mean, I'm never really like fixated on whether I sort of came up with something first or whatever, but I think in this particular instance, at least, I was the one who named the double arrows and made puzzles where it was like, this is the only constraint that you get. Whereas like Directionary, Clover, Sam, many people had puzzles where it was like, oh, this is a between line, but also it's a double arrow. But they didn't call it that. Or this is a thermo, but also it's a double arrow, or whatever, whatever else. I think doublers I'm really proud of. That's a more recent one that I really enjoy solving puzzles with doublers. Any constraint that I made where there are more than twice as many puzzles from other people who used the constraint than puzzles by me that use the constraint. I'm pretty happy when I see that. I feel like that's a pretty cool thing to have happen.
Definitely. I was thinking, oh, that would be cool, but I don't think that's ever happened for me. But actually, Technically, yes, because I made one puzzle with the multiple arrows, and there's two puzzles with the multiple arrows from other people, so it's double. Nice.
There you go.
I can now claim this. But that was inspired by your double arrow anyway, so yeah. Anyways.
I do remember for like one of my earliest, it might have been like for my first stream where I solicited puzzles for it. You said a double arrow puzzle that I thought was just fantastic. I was
Yes,
delighted.
and then I didn't like it, so then I took it and made a regular arrow with it, and it's actually a really good puzzle, and I think I like that puzzle. Like one of my favorite puzzles is that one. So there we go. It basically just uses similar deductions, but in a way that is slightly less hard to see because of the double arrow thing. Because yeah, I remember you spent a long time looking for a specific thing. It was like a
I
naked
think it was
single in
in
a
box
row.
7
Yeah.
even, if I
Yes,
recall
yes.
correctly, but
I felt really
which
bad
was
about that.
ridiculous that I
Anyways,
remember this. But
um,
I think 2 to 10th actually asked, there was a follow-up part to that I wanted to answer because I knew the answer to the second part much quicker than I knew the answer to this first part.
oh
Because
yes, yes. The follow-up was which of your rule sets would you like to catch on more than it has?
So the rule set that I thought was likely to have more people try it that I have not seen a single other puzzle that used is 10 lines. So I was really happy with the puzzle 10 lines, which are just lines where you can break it into distinct groups that sum to 10.
Mhm.
But I've never seen anyone else make a 10 lines puzzle, so I would love to see more 10-line puzzles. I thought at the time, and maybe I'm wrong, most puzzles I don't, when I set them, have any aspiration whatsoever that there will be more puzzles with this rule set. Usually it's like, okay, this is my goal is, and I mean, Mark said this a long time ago about Fistamafel, and it sort of stuck with me. Like the goal is, you know, you make the one puzzle with the rule set. That's the goal, and then you move on because the rule set's done. But
Hmm.
every once in a while, there's one where it's like, you know, I think actually you could do a bunch of different things with this. And so 10 lines is the one that at the time I thought, you know, I bet I'll see someone else do this or slight variations on it.
Well,
But
now
I
you
have
will,
not so
for
far.
sure.
So now maybe I'm going to be doing 110 lines puzzle. It's actually funny because the reason why I made 10 lines was for Rank's 100th stream, uh,
Hmm.
which must have been a bajillion years ago, I'm guessing now. But the whole idea was that there were going to be called 10 lines and there were going to be 10 of them, and 10 times 10 was 100. That was the whole motif behind the puzzle.
Interesting.
Except there are 11 of them because it was just a better puzzle if there were 11 of them than if there were 10 of them. Uh, uh, but what are you going to do? But
It's
now
very
the puzzle
funny.
is actually called 10 lines, and if you count, there's 11 of them, which just delighted slash horrified Simon.
Oh, that's very funny. Um, so speaking of your very novel rule sets and ideas, Playmaker had asked, what are your main inspirations when it comes to getting brand new ideas or unusual ideas for puzzles?
I mean, I this is a weird answer, but I don't have that much trouble with ideas. So, like, I
Hmm.
mean, the best place I look is I have an email to myself that just has a list of a bajillion ideas, and every time I have an idea, if I don't want to look at it at that particular moment, I just throw it in there, and then I can just scroll back to the beginning. And like in my setter video, I actually just like at some point on screen, this just scrolls by,
Hmm.
like part of what it looked like at that particular moment. And if you look closely, you can. You can see some things that later became puzzles, but were but a glint in my eye at the time. So, like, I would say that in terms of ideas, it's just I just have this list and I go back to it, and then I just occasionally have one. If I see a particular puzzle where it's really like where it just sort of sparks something in me, particularly when I'm watching someone else, that's often when it'll be like, oh, I could do this, or like when I'm in the shower or whatever. Sometimes it'll be like, I could do
Hmm.
this, or and a lot of times it's like, okay, I have an idea and it's an idea, but it's not quite right. And then at some point, like the thing is like, but I could combine it with this, or I could tweak it this way, or whatever is sort of more the part. But I guess this is a very long-winded way of saying the idea for me isn't the expensive part, uh,
Right.
or whatever that means, which I don't think is a very good answer, but I think is the honest answer to this.
Fair enough. Um, so I'll bust out the big guns now. This is probably the hardest question. Um, if you had to specialize in one variant and never set anything else, what would you choose?
Renbon.
Okay,
I mean,
interesting. That was
no one
not
can be
hard to
surprised
answer
by
for
that,
you.
I don't think. I mean, I think Renbon are easily the best constraint out of all of the standard constraints.
Hmm.
I don't think it is close. Uh, I think the other contenders, if I had to name like other contenders for constraints that I think have some potential to sort of like rival, if I were making a list of all the constraints, I think black dots are close, but if I could only set puzzles with black dots, that would be terrible. So I'm not going to do
Yeah.
that. And then I think killer and arrow are the other two that are sort of like possible, except that I despise killer cages, and I don't really anticipate ever setting a vanilla arrow puzzle. But I think those two are both very excellent constraints. So I think those would be very excellent choices. But I think Renbon have the best sort of collection of variety of deductions. Like I all the time do Renbon puzzles where I'm like, I feel like I've never done a Renbon puzzle like that ever before, even though
Hmm.
I've done like I do basically every Renbon puzzle I come across. Uh, I'm now going to have 26 messages on Discord of Renbon puzzles I have not done, but deal. But I mean, it's also fun to set with. I've set a number of Renbon puzzles, and
Yeah.
I will set more, I'm sure. Uh,
Okay, going back to our discussion before this question, you talked about how maybe an idea didn't work so well, but then you combine it with something else, and then it worked really well. Is that what you mean by layering, or what do you mean by layering in your puzzles?
so I'd say for me, often like, and I think in my original setting video, I think I talked about sort of like it's this interaction between the layers that really excites me, like the
Hmm.
the Sudoku plus the circle that tells you how big the polyomino it's in is.
Right.
That kind of thing, or the size is in there or whatever. That sort of interplay. And so you really have to very carefully sort of choose the rules so that they to allow for that kind of interaction. And so for me, a lot of times it's sort of about figuring out the right rule set. And I said this, and I stand by this in my setting video. I said, you shouldn't be choosing the rules for your puzzle until your puzzle's done.
Right.
Uh, and I think a lot of people sit down and say, okay, I'm going to come up with this idea for a rule set, and then set the puzzle, and then we'll see how it goes. And then we'll see how it goes. And I think you're shooting yourself in the foot if before you've put clues in a grid and put deductions in a grid, you've already decided what the rules for the puzzle are.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I think it's like, uh, I think it's very important to sort of have flexibility on that to sort of find again those sort of deductions that make me happy, that sort of like wriggle my brain in the right way or whatever, and then it's sort of to do that. But yeah, so but I do like exactly as you say. I like for there to be layers to it. It's pretty rare that it's like, okay, it's just going to be one thing. It's going to have to be a really dynamic constraint to allow me to set a puzzle that literally that's the whole puzzle.
So
Uh,
Turgenis asks or says something that I was thinking as well. How do you have an idea for a setup without a solid rule set?
so you only need one rule or maybe two rules to have a deduction, I would say.
Okay.
And so I'm not saying that you at the time have no idea what the rules will be and you just sort of draw clues in the grid and then at the very end decide what the line with the two circles on the ends means. But rather, I'm saying that people really tend to like want the specifics, and I don't think you have to decide specifics right away. So you don't have to
Hmm.
decide like, can digits repeat on this thing, yes or no? You don't have to decide whether there's a negative constraint or not. You don't have to decide like a bunch of these different things. And then you can sort of play with and tweak all of those. Or what's the second rule set I'm going to add to this, or whatever else. So I'd say like you start with a draft of the rules. Uh, and then maybe the rules end up looking like that, and maybe the rules end up looking nothing like that. It depends. Uh, Funnily enough, if you watch the MII setting video, you will watch me decide in the moment that I will try it out with a negative constraint with the idea that I'm almost certainly not going to keep it. And then I ended up keeping it, but I
That's what the
wasn't
whole
at all
puzzle's
sure of
about.
that at the time. Yeah. I was a long time into setting vignettes before I decided whether you could repeat doublers or not. Like I had that sort of in my mind as like maybe I'll want to use that and maybe I won't.
Hmm.
Uh, like the disjointness between the grids was there, but the like, do I want to say that you can't repeat a digit within doublers? I sort of thought like, oh, that
Right.
would be cool. But then I was like, that's a cool idea for a different puzzle. It
Hmm.
doesn't have to be a cool idea for this puzzle. Uh, and so sort of like I'd say at some point you decide these rules are enough, and then you go for it. But I think a lot of I think a lot of it is just sort of like do what you need, uh, and then go from there. Is my sort of philosophy with it.
So you also mentioned that was it Jetty and Sir Woozle were your sort of regular testers at the time of making that setting video?
Mhm.
Are those still testers that you go to?
They still often test. Now Vebi tests everything, and Vebi seemingly is always awake and replies to any messages right away. Uh, I also now actually for a long time if I posted something in testing, it would just get no solves. Uh,
Hmm.
I just get messages being like, "What the hell were you thinking?" But not actually solved. So it's really important that I had the
What?
testers who would always do it. Now, quite often, actually, I will get multiple tests. I mean, maybe I can dream up something that's so crazy that everyone will look at it and be like, "No, I'm not testing that." But honestly, I think the days where I was at the crazy end of setters has long passed. I think I think the people who do really extreme things now, I think there are plenty of people who have that market cornered on me. So
Hmm.
at least by some things, by comparison to some things in testing, I'm not that far extreme like I maybe once was.
Indeed. Have having regular private testers, has that impacted your setting ability or setting habits?
I mean, it's super helpful. So, like Tristan, also it should be noted, tests all of my puzzles, and so it's super
Hmm.
helpful that I get to watch him. Like I get to like stare at him intently while he looks at things and see what he sees and what he doesn't see, and then see if he sees things right away or if something is like completely oblique to him or whatever, uh, and see if he does something a completely different way. And then
Hmm.
like we've talked about this plenty of times before, but like if he does something a completely different way, am I happy about that? Am I sad about it? Do I feel like
Right.
I like did it make the puzzle not interesting or whatever if he did it? Uh, but having a consistent set of eyes is really helpful for things like a sense of how difficult a puzzle is, or
Hmm.
uh, what people like and don't, or that kind of thing is interesting and helpful for me. Uh, uh, and I feel like it's not very constructive advice to say find three people who will test whatever you send them, because I think every setter would love to have that, and probably it is not. It's not an actionable thing to say, but I mean it is helpful if you can find it. By all means, you should. I think.
Yeah, I don't know
I'm
if that's
very grateful.
advice.
I saw Vebi in chat, but I'm very grateful to
Yeah.
all of you who test my puzzles. And even the people who just test them. Jay Dyer has been solving most of my puzzles lately when they're in testing. I've really appreciated. Isabella too. Um,
Um, so let's talk about collaborative setting. Have you done any collaborative setting and sort of what have you gotten from it?
so Topsy Turvy was my first. I want to. Oh no, it was not my first. It was my second collaborative set. So I also collaboratively set a puzzle with Ranks and GeoGuessr on Ranks stream, and there's a video of that actually on my channel if you want to see us set a 159-ish arrow puzzle. Uh, but Topsy Turvy with Tallcat was a really fun experience. I'm hoping to set with Tallcat again. I'd say I've sort of contemplated or like talked about doing joint setting with others. I feel terrible that I'm going to have completely forgotten that I did collab set something with someone else. It worked very well with Tallcat because we just sort of bounced pictures of this grid back and forth
Hmm.
at each other and sort of looked at them. And then there was the beautiful moment where Tall Cat showed me the step in this puzzle where you have to realize that you know where the doubler 3 and 4 are, and
Mhm.
then I was just like, okay, it's great. We just have to sort of figure it out, but I'm sold completely. Not at all occurred to me, even though that's now like the standard doubler thing to do. Uh, it had not occurred to me at the time that that was sort of a thing that you could do, and so it's sort of like a back and forth. But I tend, unless I'm making myself record it, which I've done a couple times, I tend to set while also doing other things and flipping back to it and looking at it and seeing like, okay, well, what if I did this? What if I did that? What if I did this? And then just sort of like just let it sit and percolate at the back of my mind as I work on it. Uh, and so that worked really well because you're just sending these screenshots back and forth and little F puzzles links. Then we try it and be like, oh, are you getting that this is this, or are you getting that that is that? And that was really nice. A lot of people, when they collab set, and I think this is great too, they'll like set up a Skype call with each other and they'll talk. I mean, Skype is like from 20 years ago or whatever, but whatever the version is now, Zoom, I guess, where they'll like sit and talk through it, which sounds great, but the reality is that requires me like find 3 hours where I'm not going to do anything else, which is not
Yeah.
always easy for me to do, especially if I have to also have 3 hours where someone else does.
Mhm.
I've done a little bit of this with sort of other people, but I don't think any sort of like complete puzzles have come out of it. But I'm very open to doing it with other setters, plenty of people. I've never said no when someone has asked me to sort of talk about it. But uh, the the origin of Topsy Turvy actually was that I published vignettes, and I said that
Mhm.
in the original draft of vignettes there was going to be between lines as one of the grids because I thought it would be interesting. Uh, but then it turned out to be obnoxious because it was far more complicated than any of the things. Like the ones that
Right.
actually appear in vignettes are sort of the constraints that end up being easy with doublers, and between lines was not one of those.
Right.
Uh, and so Tallcat was like, "Pick me, pick me, pick me! I'll do it." To do the one as the resident between line expert. And so yes, so Tallcat just like heard me say the word between lines and was like, "Okay,
Right.
let's do it." And so then we did. Uh, so that was interesting and fun, and I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Definitely. Let's go into some questions for my man Zach. So first of all, because obviously most of your puzzles are collaborations with Zach. Let's be real here. Uh,
Zach actually doesn't like Sudoku that much, but don't tell anyone.
oh no,
So.
that's hot gossip. What what is Zach's favorite kind of fish?
Zach is very fond of herring.
Ah, okay. The swordfish. Noted.
Not the swordfish. Yeah,
Does
they're too pointy.
that's a Nell Gwyn question, by the way. I'll put that in the chat. Artifix Amanda had asked, now I need to know if Zach indeed has hats or a favorite hat.
Hats or a favorite hat. Zach does not currently have hats, but Zach could
Hmm.
have hats. That is a potential thing. Isabella posted this wonderful image of Zach in Tall Cat's hat,
Hmm.
which shows up on the Discord a great deal that I really adore. I now have to get Zach a Tall Cat hat so that Zach can dress up.
Oh, that reminds me. Tallcat sent me a picture of him wearing a Tallcat hat in real life, and I still haven't put that on the thumbnail. Need to do that. The other question that Artifix Amanda had was, what is Zach's inspiration for dancing, or for his dances?
He had a Liger as his dancing mentor who taught him all of the appropriate
Okay.
digit dances, and so he extemporaneizes now some because he's now becoming an expert. So he does some of his own things, but that was how he started out, was
Nice.
by going through a rigorous digit dancing program.
Right. Are the dances the same for every digit for every stream, or does he sort of adapt and change his dances over time?
Uh, They change slowly. We'll say they evolve slowly over time. So there's established dances, but
Right.
sometimes, let's be honest, it's mostly Tall Cat complains that two of the dances are a little too similar. So we move a little bit or make some changes to sort of distinguish some of the dances, so it's a little more clear what digit is being danced for at a particular time.
Right. That's what people mean when they say telegraphing is the which digit is being danced for, right?
It's true, but an experienced viewer should be able to tell what digit
Yes.
Zach is dancing for, even without audio or I'd say without video. But I suppose they have to be able to see Zach dancing without seeing the grid. We'll see.
And is it true that Tallcat is training to be the background dancer for Zach?
I believe Tall Cat has his own digit dancing animal who is training to be a backup
Okay.
dancer. But we'll see. Perhaps we can get Tall Cat to dance for the 100th anniversary stream.
Okay, perfect. Speaking of streams and YouTube, Rom Planer had asked a sort of funny question. If you could choose between your channels on YouTube, which one would you prefer to have a single viral video of 100 million hits out of nowhere?
It's an interesting question. Of course, my brain immediately when I read this was like, which one would I get more money off of? Because my math channel, the videos are like an hour long, so that's like a lot of ad revenue. So there's sort of like an inclination for that, yeah, but it would be pretty cool if it were a Sudoku thing because it would mean more people were getting into Sudoku. And so I think in terms of like monetarily, I think the
Hmm.
math one would.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I should just mention to the chat that my name zetamath actually came from the fact that I started a YouTube channel, I think before I even did Sudoku at all, to talk about the math behind the Riemann hypothesis and the zeta function and those sorts of things. And so then the name was just the name I had on Discord. So then when I was on the Cracking the Cryptic Discord, that was the name I displayed under. So then that was what I posted my puzzle under. And so then that became my setter name. Uh, but I think in terms of what would give me more joy overall, I think it would be if it was the Sudoku channel, because it would mean that millions of people were getting into crazy Sudoku variant stuff. And that would assuredly lead to more cool puzzles for me to do. Not that there's any shortage of those. But I think that has to be the answer. And not just because I'm being interviewed by a Sudoku person, but also partially because I'm being interviewed by a Sudoku person.
That would also be my preference because then more people get into Sudoku and, trickle down on all that. Um, Directionary had asked, what's your Sudoku class all about? Are you starting with gas puzzles or something? And how are you planning to grade the students?
So I am teaching a puzzle, or sorry, an intro course where you can teach an intro course over January. So this is going to be like a 3-week course,
Hmm.
just in Sudoku setting. So the goal
Hmm.
is just to get students making their own puzzles. So they'll solve puzzles partially, so that they can learn about all the things that you can do to make puzzles. But the goal is really to just get them to make their own puzzles and experience sort of the creative aspects of this as sort of like an alternative creative outlet, and think about that, and also think about the sort of the game design aspects of what makes people enjoy these puzzles or not enjoy these puzzles, what makes me enjoy puzzles or not enjoy puzzles, that kind
Hmm.
of thing. So I deliberately called the course the art of Sudoku and not the math of Sudoku because sorry Jovial, we will not be talking about exosets in the class or any of the like. There's lots of fancy, cool math that goes into Sudoku, but the class is emphatically not about that. The class is about sort of designing puzzles. Uh,
I will stand up for
how I'll
Jovial
grade it, I
and
have
say that
absolutely no idea. Uh,
I'll stand up for Jovial and say that that is art, but which is what she'll probably say to that. Um, David Silverstone had asked, what is, in your view, the least good thing about the puzzling community and what can be done to resolve that?
I think the least good thing about the puzzling community is the people who, like David Silverstone.
Oh yeah,
That's got
sorry,
to be David
Daniel.
Silverstone.
Daniel.
Uh,
Let's see.
uh, Daniel
Sorry.
also says Daniel. Uh,
Thank you.
uh, is the people who do Sudoku in order to make themselves feel smart. I think that's fine. But there are plenty of people who do Sudoku to make themselves feel smart then use that to make to feel smart by making other people feel dumb,
Hmm.
by like reflexively saying that every puzzle is actually only 2 out of 5 or 1 out of 5, or uh, telling people that they shouldn't take so long on puzzles or whatever. Like there's lots of these, and these show up in LMD comments all the time. Like
Hmm.
I know lots of other people would name other things that happen on LMD, but I think this is actually the more toxic, corrosive thing that happens, is people sort of trying to uh, downplay the difficulty, or basically just make people feel bad about it. And I think there's no reason to do that. We should try as possible, or as much as possible, to be inviting and encouraging of people solving puzzles. And if they solve a puzzle and it takes them a long time, great. They solved it. That's
Yeah.
amazing. And I think we should take that sort of attitude towards it.
Sarah. Um,
And to be clear, so Sarah, I actually want to answer that. So Sarah asked,
yeah.
people do Sudoku to feel smart. I think most people do not do Sudoku to feel smart, but I think some people do. And I think it's totally fine that some people do that, but I think they have to be very careful in how they interact with others where that's not their motivation.
Hmm.
Uh, because otherwise you can end up inadvertently making people feel bad.
Indeed. Um, Not a related question, but Robert Tolbert asked in the chat, what constraint is overused?
Constraint is overused. I think probably I would have to say German whispers if I was to pick a constraint. That I think really there's probably one puzzle's worth of German whisper puzzles,
Yes.
and there are probably 25,000
Yeah.
German whispers puzzles. I mean, I really like the German whispers puzzle, so I mean, I'm part of the problem because I do them. But I mean, it's the same puzzle every time.
Yeah.
There's not like there's a deduction, maybe 1.5 deductions in German whispers, and they're very fun and they're cool. But I think the variety wise, uh, although like German whispers and Renbahn are both line constraints, I think they're miles apart in terms of what you could do with them.
Hmm. I tend to agree. Um, whenever I solve a German whispers puzzle for someone, I tell them, well, I didn't like it, but to be fair, I'm just so tired of this same puzzle over and over and over and over. um, so it's nothing to do with the puzzle. It's just this is not working for me anymore. Um, how long does it take you to set normally, and what environment do you prefer to set in?
So I'd say probably the average is a week
Hmm.
for how long it takes me to set a puzzle, sort of from like, okay, I'm sort of sketching stuff out and adding stuff and whatever. I mostly set in my living room, although this particular semester my schedule is set up so that it's terrible, so that I teach at 8 a.m. and then have a meeting at 5 p.m. every day.
Oh,
So I just have all this time in my office on a couple days, and so I've been setting a lot in my office lately. So extra, which is my most recent puzzle, was set almost entirely in my office during that sort of like time. But that one took like a month because, oh my God, I'm never setting a Sudoku X ever again. It was a terrible idea to try to do this. So just to elaborate slightly, this is a puzzle with a global constraint, which is sort of like the Sudoku X, and then there's sort of these two extra regions in it having to do with sort of this doubler adjacent thing that I really like. Actually, Andrew has suggested calling them transversals, which is I think is the name I will go with if I do any more puzzles with transversals. Uh, but the effect of this is that this puzzle is actually unique after you put in like 5 clues or something absolutely ridiculous like this, but nowhere remotely close to humanable.
Hmm.
And so it did not even remotely occur to me how much this grid was actually restricted. And so what kept happening is I kept like adding a clue and then being like, wow, this could be tons of deductions. And it almost got there. And then suddenly I'd have 2 5s in yellow or whatever other thing would happen, and then I'd rewind it. And so actually, finally, and so I just was like, I had enough, and I like asked if anyone had a if anyone had a solver that could handle basically killer cages with cells that were scattered across the grid.
Hmm.
And Hero Woofer said, well, it doesn't support it yet, but give me a minute. And then now Sudoku Studio supports that. And so then using the Sudoku Studio, I was able to sort of see what was actually happening and being like,
Hmm.
oh, so when I add this clue that does this really cool thing, I'm actually reducing the number of solutions the grid has to 0. So it doesn't matter what clues I add after that. Uh, it's always going to break. And so I was able to like finally like find a solved grid and then add appropriate clues to the solved grid so that it's humanable. Uh, which is like on the one hand, like people are really enjoying the puzzle, which is great. I'm very happy to have that. I have nothing but hatred for this puzzle, owing to the amount of time I spent on it. But there are so many cool versions along the way where there are all of these really awesome, like very difficult, but I thought very cool deductions that used all the Sudoku geometry with the various disjoint regions playing against each other. And ultimately, the final version of the puzzle has none of that because there's just like the puzzle's just immediately unique. And so like I really love the first, and so like the reason I stuck with it is I really loved the first like few steps of it as you sort of fill in all of the grid, like what the coloring looks like and those sorts of things. But then really there was like 0 grid control after that.
Right.
Uh, so anyway, I don't know how I got onto this, but that's my that's the setting story of Extra.
No worries, I
Uh,
wanted to ask about it anyway, so that's why I hit it up. Um, I want to ask this before we get too far in. The Sonic person had asked, why do you have a fascination with Schrodinger cell puzzles? And I think that's very specifically phrased in a way that makes me intrigued. Why?
So I'd say and this is true of lots of constraints. There are lots
Hmm.
of constraints where I like see them, I do a puzzle or 2 or 3 or 4 or 8. And then sort of like the more puzzles with them I do, the more I start to see like what I consider the weaknesses of that
Hmm.
constraint. Uh, so I think S cells have a very clear weakness, which is that it is incredibly, incredibly easy to accidentally completely break the puzzle and have no idea where you broke it.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's pretty universal across SL puzzles. And so I think it's pretty easy for lots of solvers to spend an hour on an SL puzzle, get almost to the end, and then realize they've broken it and have absolutely no idea where. Uh, Whereas, like most constraints, I think even if you break it, you can sort of rewind and figure it out. Whereas in an SL puzzle, you probably made a deduction that was wrong. It was probably 45 minutes ago.
Hmm.
And what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of this is like most SL puzzles are solved in a context of someone streaming it while the setter is looking at a solved grid to make sure no one says anything that is wrong because then it'll break the puzzle.
Hmm.
In fact, there's a very specific spot in Kodama where everyone breaks the puzzle. For example, uh, so I now am less enthused about them. I mean, I think they let you do some very cool geometry. I really like them, but ultimately, I don't. I mean, I've only set 2 puzzles with them. I don't really intend to set more puzzles with them
Right.
because of that. And actually, if you go back to it, doublers are really attempting just basically to capture what's cool
Hmm.
about S cells with slightly less S cells in them
Yeah.
uh, because of that. Uh, I guess like why do you think it's cool? It's there's a cell with 2 digits in it. How cool is that? I mean, there's so many things
So
you could do
cool.
with it, and it interacts with every constraint
Yeah.
in an interesting way. I think it's just intrinsically awesome. You get to make
Yeah.
all these kinds of cool deductions, which is the kind of thing I love, is to be able to take a sort of vanilla constraint and then combine it with one wacky idea, and S cells do that beautifully. Uh, just then they make puzzles break too easily for solvers. I don't think it's so bad on the setting side, but I think it's really
No.
bad on the solving side.
I mean, it can
So
be, but yeah, it really, really can be. Yeah. That what is it called? Bose-Einstein condensate. Oh, that was really annoying to set. But
oh, is that the
anyways,
between lines one?
yes, I should not have done that. Uh, that sucked.
Uh,
Anyways, it was a really cool puzzle, but it's anyways, back to us. Jovial had asked, what's more elegant to you, simple rules leading to complex mechanics or complex rules leading to complex mechanics?
I think it depends on what you're going for. I think
Okay.
complex rules tend to lead to simpler deductions, I would say. Usually you sort of have either you have you have two options really. If you're going with simple rules, then you're saying you have these, say, two tools in front of you. Uh, and you have to figure out which of these two tools is useful or how am I supposed to use them. And so you have to do, if you're going to make a puzzle that only uses two tools, you have to make very complicated things with them.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a more complicated rule set, like I think my most complicated rule set would be, oh no, what's the puzzle called? The second one with black dots. Why can I not think of this? Cropgiamonos is the name of the puzzle. This is the most complicated rule set I have. I think all the deductions in this puzzle are easy because it has 65 rules. And so you just have to decide which of the 65 rules to apply. And then you're basically done with the thing. So I'd say I think you can make fun things with either. I think if you make a complicated rule set with then you have to make complicated deductions with those rules, then I think you're probably doing it wrong in a way to do this. So I think both of them have options.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them can lead to good puzzles. It just depends on what kind of puzzle you're trying to set. And I think, as with all things, you have to use the choices or use your tools wisely when you're deciding what kinds of rules to make.
Indeed. Bevy had asked, what motivates you to make puzzles and what aspects of the entire process do you enjoy the most? I think we've gotten to a little bit of that, but
So I enjoy sharing them with people. I enjoy seeing people do them. I enjoy like getting messages from people with like, oh, I finished this grid and I really liked this part or whatever. That's super fun. The best part of setting is when you are past the part where you have an interesting step to start with, or at least for me, where I sort of like, I'm past the part where I have this interesting step. And then things just sort of go in the, are sort of like going in the grid and proceeding. And then everything sort of falls into place. Like Two Truths and a Lie was just
mm-hmm.
like I figured out. So my original opening of Two Truths and a Lie was that there were going to be two X's in a row, exactly like at the bottom of the grid of Archa. But that wasn't fun enough. So then I was like, oh, but I could put two arrows in the top row, and that doesn't work. And as soon as I had that, I was like, oh, so I can put a third arrow in, and then I know it's true. And then the rest of the puzzle was done in an evening. And that's sort of like, that's like the flow version of setting, where it's like, once I figured out the first step, it's one of the easiest puzzles I've ever set. As far as setting it goes, not as far as solving it goes, to be clear. And so that sort of that sense of flow in setting is really, really satisfying, I would say.
Let's do, well, actually, we'll do Grackle's question before we get to rapid fire, but Grackle's asked, what constraint do you think has the worst name and what would you rename it to instead?
It's also German Whispers. The fact that the name of German Whispers does not have the number 5 in it is sinful. They should be called like greater than 5 lines or 5+ lines or something in some way that you could easily generalize it so that you could call. But instead, we've got this ridiculous system where it's like, oh, but there's Chinese whispers and Dutch whispers. And it's like, these could be less than 3 lines and greater than 4 lines or whatever. I think the system is as uninviting as it is possible to be. Yeah, I think it is just and the reason why it's named that is terrible. It is every part of the naming of that is bad.
So what I'm getting from this is that your ideal puzzling community is we rename German Whispers to something involving 5, and then no one ever uses it again.
Something like, I mean, I think German Whispers are a fantastic addition to a puzzle that is about low-high coloring.
Yeah.
in some other way. So, like, I mean, there's lots of constraints that interact with low-high coloring. So I'm not at all suggesting that I think German whispers should never be used in puzzles. I think there are some amazing puzzles that use German whispers. There was a German whispers Renban puzzle I remember by it was by two people, and I'm not going to remember who it was,
Cane
unfortunately.
puzzles
Yes.
and
Okay. Excellent. Excellent. You know it. You
I
know who it
can't
is.
remember
Okay.
the other name. Cane puzzles and someone. Bot. There's a bot. Bots.
They're just excited about Sudoku.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it can be a fine supplement to other constraints. I just don't think like a puzzle that's mostly German whispers. I don't think we need more of those. I could just go back and do the ones that already exist and would be fine. Is my my basic version. But yeah, I more or less you're correct.
Okay. Andrew Sock is in Cane puzzles. Yes. Okay. Sorry, Andrew.
Is it really? Well, that must mean it was a long time ago because I didn't know who. If that's true, I didn't know who Andrew Sarkis was at the time. But that was
me
an
neither.
awesome
Yeah, it
puzzle.
wasn't a long time ago. That one actually inspired one of mine, so I also love that puzzle. Which is why when you said it, I was like, yes, I know this puzzle. Okay, rapid fire questions before we're through. Okay, so just answer one of the two options. I think yeah, there's only two for each one. Or if there's three for one, but that's a 3-for-1 deal. There you go. Local or global deductions?
Local.
Coloring or good living?
Coloring.
Geometry or arithmetic?
Geometry.
Penpa or F puzzles?
F puzzles.
Sudoku or pencil puzzles?
Sudoku.
Chaos or order?
Yes.
Cages, lines, or dots?
Lines.
Givens or a clue to disambiguate a puzzle?
Clue.
Okay. Interesting. I should do like a statistics chart on who picked what at some point.
I feel like anyone who has like interacted with me a lot could have guessed 100% what I would say for every single one of those. But
I think so.
That is yeah. Tristan says in chat, yeah, I could have told you all of those. Yeah. Why is it Penpa or F puzzles? Why isn't it Penpa or F puzzles or the good one?
Because those are setting options.
Setting options. Okay, well,
okay,
then
so for solving.
In that case, for solving CTC,
yeah. Okay.
For setting Penpa, I said almost everything I said in Penpa.
Mm-hmm.
But all I want is for CTC to let me set puzzles in CTC, and then I will be happy. That's what I want for Christmas, Ben, please.
That's right. Oh, actually, someone did ask in the Discord, which, by the way, I don't usually check the Discord while we're streaming because it's a little bit hard to do. So it's better to ask questions in the chat, and sometimes I pick them up. But someone asked in the Discord if you could ask Sven or Ranks to implement one thing in one of the softwares, what would you suggest, and which color would it be, is their question. I think it's a Lima.
I see. What color would it be? I was going to say, I thought I was going to be able to ask them to implement setting in CTC.
They're just joking. I guess you could ask that.
In terms of like, yeah, if they want to actually implement a constraint, I mean, really that useful. I mean, I think implementing doublers would be cool. Like, be cool. I think it would not be that difficult to interact it with lots of things. It would be impossible, I'm sure, but I think that would be cool. Isabella suggested different betting tree colors. I do agree, more usable colors, but more usable colors are, I'm assured, coming. I have seen GIFs of CTC with more usable colors.
Speaking of F puzzles versus Penpa, what are your opinions on using rank solver?
I think it can be a fantastic tool depending on what you're setting. I think you have to be very careful with what you're using it for, because I think it's very possible to talk yourself into thinking that a deduction is humanable when it is not humane, at least, because you saw the solver tell you something. But I think for puzzles where you're afraid that you might break the puzzle with a clue you added and not realize it, like extra, for example, although I didn't at all realize this until like way into solving the puzzle, that this was actually what was happening. But I think making sure you haven't broken the puzzle can be very useful. And seeing what actually does something, I think, can be useful. I think people can talk themselves into putting things in their puzzles that they absolutely should not put in their puzzles with it. So I'd say most of the time when I'm setting, there is no computer solver involved at any phase. But sometimes there is, and it's very useful to have it when I want it.
Indeed. I totally agree on those points. Why does this always happen where I'm thinking of something and then all of a sudden it's just gone? Is there any other points you wanted to touch on before we close out?
I think one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, if you just want a like random setting
Yeah.
piece of wisdom that I've been thinking about lately, is I've been thinking about that puzzle in the water temple in Wind Waker. And so if you've never played Wind Waker, it is a Zelda game, and there is this puzzle where there's like 14 wooden planks in a room filled with water. And you realize almost immediately that what you have to do is arrange the 14 wooden planks in such a way that Link can hop from one end of the room to the other. And Link can only jump this little short distance, and so if they're not exactly spaced right, then you fall in the water and you have to go back and do it again.
Mm-hmm.
This is the exact opposite of what you want in puzzles, because you realize in 10 seconds what the solution to the puzzle is, because I mean it's pretty clear. It's very well telegraphed, you could say. But then yes, perfect. This exact room. But then you spend another 15 minutes getting it to actually work. And I think if you look at the things that I'm most reluctant to do in puzzles when I'm solving them, it's things where I realize it's like, I probably should do this. It's going to take me a long time. And so I think the big problem in puzzles that you want to avoid is you want to avoid someone figuring out what they're supposed to do and then putting a huge amount of time between them doing it.
Right.
So like one of the things I'm thinking about is like counting in, say, chaos constructions or whatever, where it's like, oh, I'm going to count this and it's not going to be a multiple of 9 and that's going to tell me this thing, but it's going to take me like, I'm going to have to like very meticulously do it. And it's very easy to count wrong,
Right.
not just because you don't know what order the numbers go in, although that's been a problem for me on stream a lot too, but also because you have to be super careful and precise about exactly what you're counting, exactly how many cells there have to be. And so I think part of good puzzle setting is making the window between I understand what I should do and it's now done as short as possible. So that is my random setter thing that I have been thinking about lately.
It's a very interesting random setter thing. All right, it has been 2 hours.
It's very random. I think it's probably more random than you were expecting.
Definitely. Thank you so much, zetamath, for participating, and I loved listening to you, and yeah, value everything you say.
Thank you for having me. This has been a blast. I look forward to more of your setting related stuff in the future. I've been really enjoying your channel, and I'm glad to see that many others have been enjoying it as well. So it's very cool.
Thank you.
You've been doing this.
And if anyone somehow ended up here but is not watching Zeta's channel, he makes some great content as well. So head over there and subscribe to him. I'm imagining most people are probably already subscribed to you if they're subscribed to me, but there could be one or two. So.
And I do have a couple of videos of me setting puzzles from start to finish over there. I think there's 3. So I mean, mostly I stream myself solving, but if you're interested from this in my setting and what that actually looks like, I have a few videos over there. One of me setting MIA, one of me setting Usual Suspects, and one of me collab setting with Ransk and GeoGesser. So if you're interested in seeing what me setting actually looks like in practice, I recommend checking those out.
Yeah, and if you have any interest in setting and you're not sure if you want to do it, I actually do recommend people check out your setting video, because it's a good, like, if you don't know if you want to do it, but you kind of want, like, what would this be like? I think that's a very good one. That's a sort of low bar to entry. So
I'm really happy how many people have told me they started setting because of that video. That really is very rewarding to hear.
Indeed. All right, well, everyone have a great rest of your weekend. Have a good Thanksgiving if you're in Canada. And yeah.
So
Which
we
is
should be
like,
wishing you a good Thanksgiving, as
yes,
my understanding.
indeed. Which is like 0.3% of my audience, but to those 0.3, have a good Thanksgiving. All right. I realized as I was saying it that it's only in Canada that we have Thanksgiving right now. So I was like, no, that's completely irrelevant to 100% of my audience, basically. Anyways, goodbye.